Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. My name's Maddie Beery. I am a senior in the Questrom School of Business, concentrating in law and information systems. And today I am presenting stock buybacks in science-based industries, innovation sacrifices for shareholder gains. And this was a group project done through the Questrom Honors Capstone. So just going through a brief agenda, I'm going to start by introducing stock buybacks and some of the prior research surrounding them. Then I'm going to move into my methodology and results, and then finally some implications for different policies that have been proposed. So if you don't know what a stock buyback is, that's okay, because I honestly didn't either when I started this. But all it is that a company is repurchasing its own shares from the open market, reducing the number of shares outstanding. And there's a variety of reasons that companies do this. If they have extra cash, they can help return it to their shareholders. They can improve important financial metrics like earnings per share, which you can see in the box on the top of the screen. And overall, it just kind of helps boost confidence in the company. And usually an announcement of a buyback will lead to a boost in the stock price as well. Now, despite this, there is a lot of controversy surrounding the use of buybacks, especially based on concerns that companies are using them to meet short-term financial targets at the expense of investment in other areas that might be more productive. Just a few of those areas could be employee training and development, increased wages, environmental and social responsibility, and capital investments like research and development, which will be the focus of this project. You can see on the graph on the right that buybacks have been increasing over time, and there was a spike in 2018 after the Trump administration announced corporate income tax cuts. But despite this increase, SEC rules governing buybacks haven't been changed actually since 2003. So for this project, we focused in on the life science industry because the controversies surrounding buybacks in this area has some more implications for the general public. This is because investments in R&D are really crucial for the design and development of products that can be life-saving. So ultimately, we hypothesized that among top-performing life science companies operating in the pharmaceutical, medical device, and biotech sectors, stock buybacks are negatively correlated with investments in research and development. Now, looking at some of the prior research in this area, in July 2021, the House Committee on Oversight and Reform published a report that showed that pharmaceutical companies were on average spending significantly more on buybacks than they were on R&D. This paper was the inspiration for our project in a lot of ways, but there were two gaps that we wanted to address. First, their sample was limited to pharmaceutical companies versus including other sectors. And then their sample also didn't have firms that hadn't pursued buybacks as a point of comparison. So those are two changes that we made in our research methodology. And then going into our project methodology, we selected the top 100 public companies in the US across our chosen sectors, which are pharmaceuticals, biotech, and medical devices, and then sorted those by 2016 revenue, and we used CompuStat to pull our data. And then for every year from 2016 to 2020, we separated the companies into firms that had pursued buybacks that year and firms that hadn't pursued buybacks in that year. And the key metric that we looked into was R&D as a percentage of revenue, and this was done just to account for differences in company size. Ultimately, we found that when adjusted for revenue, firms conducting buybacks invested significantly less in research and development. In the graph on the left, you can see companies that didn't pursue buybacks with the gray bars and then companies that did with the red bars. And you can see that for every year, there is a gap between buyback and non-buyback firms in terms of R&D. On average, the gap was somewhere around 7% for all 5 years we studied. And then in 2020, you can see that gap actually shrank, and that's just potentially due to the COVID pandemic and shifting investment priorities during that time. Next, we did the same analysis, but for each of the three sectors. And what we found was that the pharmaceutical sector exhibited a wider R&D disparity between buyback and non-buyback firms. This difference was actually nearly double that we observed in our sample as a whole. And this just indicated to us that the pharmaceutical sector's results were really driving the gap for the full sample. What was really interesting to us was that in the biotech and medical device sectors, buyback firm R&D spending was actually matching or even surpassing that of control firms. For biotech companies, we saw that buyback firms dedicated a greater portion of revenue to R&D in every year except for 2017. And then for medical device companies, we saw buyback firms dedicate a greater portion of revenue to R&D in all 5 years we studied. So key takeaways from our results really were just that stock buybacks don't inherently detract from R&D investments in the life science industry. We observed key sector level differences with medical device and biotech firms appearing to be more effectively managing the trade-off between buybacks and R&D. And then obviously we see the wide R&D gap among pharmaceutical companies, which is definitely concerning from a public health standpoint. So taking these findings into consideration, it really helps kind of with the debate around regulations and whether stricter regulations are necessary to protect innovation, scientific progress, and patient access to new treatments. Now we're going to be looking into some different policies that have been proposed in the US. So 2 of these are the Reward Work Act and then the Worker Dividend Act. The Reward Work Act would actually ban open market buybacks altogether, and companies would have to conduct them through tender offers that would require more disclosure. And then for the Worker Dividend Act, any company that conduct a buyback would have to give employees some sort of proportional financial benefit just so they could sort of share in the wealth that the buybacks generate. And then overall, like many different countries have stricter regulations on buybacks than the US does. One of those examples is the UK, where all share repurchases have to be approved by shareholders. And then there's just a lot more disclosures about the purpose of buybacks, so you can tell kind of what the intention is behind them. So just to wrap things up, there's a lot of debate over whether regulations are best left to companies' board of directors or if there should be more broad increased laws and regulations surrounding buybacks. And it's really important to help determine the best path forward for 2 different reasons. First, to ensure that companies are really acting in their best long-term interests, and then more specifically for life science companies to ensure that they're focusing on public health and well-being and not just on maximizing profits. And then just to acknowledge some people that gave me some good help with this project. Thank you to my advisors, Professor Conti and Simcoe, and then also Professor Cortez, who's the director of the honors program. Of course, I have to shout out my team members, Nick, Aaron, and Julia, for their help with this project. And then also the Questrom Honors Program and the Mehrotra Institute, which gave us actually the opportunity to present our research at a summit earlier this month and then to have a panel discussion with some experts in the industry. So that was really interesting. And yeah, that's it. Thank you, guys.
Great presentation, thank you. I learned a lot. So stock buybacks shouldn't have any material effect on the company's performance. It's just a change in who owns the stock, not in what the company does. R&D should make a difference in terms of the company's performance. Did you look at that at all? Like, is R&D related to, does R&D connect to earnings? Are shareholders better off if profits are spent on R&D than if they're spent on stock buybacks?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Professor Stolo. So a big debate is really this issue of kind of short-termism in business. Like what you said, stock buybacks really shouldn't have material impact on a business's performance in the long term. And yet, because of the way executive compensation is structured in a lot of these companies and how that's tied to stock performance, we see companies pursuing buybacks to get that short-term boost in the stock price. Whereas obviously R&D, while risky and expensive, is a lot better for a company's bottom line in the long run. So it's not something we looked into with specific data, for example, but it's definitely a concern in just these trade-offs between short-term thinking and long-term decision-making.
Hi, Maddie. Great presentation. You're awesome. I was just curious if there was one new interesting thing you've learned throughout this process.
Thanks for the question, Kaylee. I think coming into this, I didn't necessarily realize the nuance behind stock buybacks. I think my initial thought was just that we should restrict them more, but it's really more nuanced than that. And I think I learned that a lot through the panel that we had at the summit. We had a former CFO from Alexion and Biogen talk to us about the purpose of buybacks. And he mentioned that there's really only so many positive NPV projects a company can take on, or just, I guess, profitable projects. So buybacks in that sense can really be a more effective alternative to using that cash and giving it back to shareholders versus investing in projects that just aren't profitable. So I think that kind of understanding that there is an upside and a downside to them is something new that I learned. Yeah.
Hey, Maddie, great presentation. I'm just wondering because presentation you mentioned there's kind of like a big discrepancy between like big pharma companies and like the rest of the life science industry when it comes to like buybacks and R&D spending. Is there like a specific reason why there's such a big discrepancy, and what maybe like some of the next steps that we can do to kind of even that out?
Yeah, that's a great question, Derek. So ultimately, this data is correlational, so that's definitely a limitation. And I think there could be some underlying reasons behind the discrepancy. Something we didn't look into in this project is mergers and acquisitions. That's an important way that firms can innovate outside of just in-house R&D spending. So it would be interesting to see if you took that into effect, what the impact would be on the gap that we saw among pharmaceutical companies. But ultimately, it is just correlational, and it could be the case that there just aren't profitable projects to be investing in.
All right. Thank you very much, Maddie.